Welcome, Wargamers, to the bizarre bazaars, trade hubs, payday lenders, and bounty hunters of Ulfenkarn, because today we are talking about Wightmarc, one of the major districts of Ulfenkarn set in the Age of Sigmar universe, as we continue exploring the city of Ulfenkarn that sets game masters and players up for a great time exploring with the game Soulbound. That's the role-playing game for Age of Sigmar by Cubicle 7. And we've been going through each of the major districts. There's 5 of them in total that make up the city, with the last one being the Citadel itself that you have to fight the big boss at. And each of these locations has their own, problems, locations, enemies, and so on. And so today we're going to do a spoiler-free introduction to Wightmarc, a distinct district here on the map. We'll discuss what makes Wightmarc unique amongst the other districts that you'll encounter, and we'll hit you up with some information that the average person would have available to them. Nothing spoilerific, but just general information if you were meandering through the town, you would pick up about the area. Now, one thing I'd like to add up top here is that this is all possible because of the great folks at Cubicle 7 who sent me an advanced copy of Ulfenkarn, City at the Edge of Death, and because of awesome folks like you. I have a link tree in my description down below where you can save a bunch of money by shopping for anything you want, miniatures or role-playing game related. And every time you use those links, hopefully to go grab some Soulbound materials for yourself, you directly support me, my wife, our cats, the whole channel, and I could not be more thankful for each and every one of you. And as we've mentioned before, every bit of Mournhold, when it turned into Ulfenkarn, there's that before and after effect, that story litters every inch of this entire city. This section in particular was really defined as the epicenter of trade, production, and mercantilism. If Gaunt's lectern was full of book nerds and Ebonshade was full of theater kids, Wightmarc is the buttress of business bros. Now, the less jokey answer is that back when the city was Mournhold, this district had 3 pretty much distinct functions. It was a market, it was a port, and it manufactured things. This is a bulk of where the Mournhold citizenry would work when the city was bustling. Factory jobs, craft guilds, trade, and so on. In fact, the towering edifice at its center, the Van Alten Skyport, was erected to function as a dock for the Kharadron overlords so that they could have trade during the Age of Chaos. Remember, there's this weird lull period in this city's history where the Age of Sigmar had already begun, so the Kharadron overlords had come back, but it was before the Necroquake, so Radjikar's not in power yet. So there's this weird little lapse of time where they were like, maybe we can make this work, and trade with the outside world was super important. And this Skyport is directly, it would allow trade to the heart of Mournhold. Forget the ports. And when things were good, this seemed exceptionally forward-thinking, right? Where the biggest trade power, because of their geographical location, and if the next big step or innovation in trade is the use of sky dwarf couriers, then you'd better believe that they want in on that, right? They want to stay ahead of the curve, and so they built this massive tower. And fun fact about the city, this is the only structure that's allowed to be anywhere near as tall as the Ebon Citadel. And below that tower is all the stuff we mentioned before, right? Guild halls, embassies, storage, warehouses, as well as the city's limited industrial capacity. While the main moneymaker, of course, was trade, they did have the same kind of arcane industrial revolution that everyone else did during the Age of Myth. So they knew how to construct some basic manufacturing machines and so on. You'd think textiles and weapon crafting and that kind of stuff. And the story of this district is interesting because of how little it changed, almost. Right? Everybody else had this big dramatic night and day shift, but when the Age of Chaos began and when Radjikar joined the city, nothing here really changed, and the reason is very simple and very practical. It's just too necessary to be disturbed. People need jobs. They need stuff. Craftsmen still need to ply their trade, now more than ever, if they can be used to drive off chaos, right? Even when Radjikar wasn't in power and he's still just a part of the city's, regular military, he needs these people to create weapons for his undead army. So unlike Ebonshade, which was already in decline when the Necroquake hit, this place was still bustling out of pure necessity, which makes it really sad. This place had a great shot of being left alone, except that it was one of the districts that was rocked the hardest physically by the Necroquake. And so let's get into what this place has become, right? That's our our established guild hub, high education, business bros, trade, mercantilism, all of that. What is it now? Well, what's the dark parody of a trade hub? Funny enough, it's not different. It's just worse. Let's start with this. First of all, I mentioned that the city, or the district rather, was physically affected by the Necroquake. What I mean by that is just sinkholes, like huge blocks of the city just dropped into the earth. We mentioned during the Catacombs episode that the tectonic activity just got jumbled around, hallways were moved, and old temples and tombs were shifted into new places. The same thing happened here. Huge portion of the district just sunk several blocks into the earth itself. And what's interesting, the way it's described, it's almost like a few blocks of the city went down, but they stayed level with themselves. Like, they didn't just crumble into dust. They just literally went down a floor of the house. And so what this meant was you have this whole block and a half of people who are hanging out, right? Normal business owners trying to survive. And when they get dropped into the earth, all of a sudden, all those doors to the catacombs we mentioned before in that previous one, well, now they're in every direction. The zombies don't come up from the ground, they just walk in from the left, because now you've come down to their level. At the same time as this huge wave of undead magic is reanimating every corpse around. And so my mental picture reading this, just to give you a sense, is imagine if you're chilling in your house one night, and then your house gets dropped into that exact plot of land that the house from Night of the Living Dead happened, and all of a sudden there's just zombies everywhere. But let's say you fight the zombies, you seal up the catacomb doors as they open or as you find them. You're still going to be very disturbed by the weird sounds you hear in Wightmarc, because if you're in that lower area that fell into the earth, you're going to hear a weird splat every once in a while. What that splat is zombies up on the surface level, wandering aimlessly, falling into these huge chasms and pits that were opened in the Necroquake. So you have zombies and dead bodies to your left and to your right, and now they're falling on you. It just rains corpses every once in a while. And all of those things combined is what I just described is the safest place to be in Wightmarc. It's a place called Barrow Hill. And while Barrow Hill is as exactly as we just walked through it, right? A whole block that just went down to the earth, now there's undead everywhere, falling in on them. It's highly indicative of the district as a whole. Because even though a disaster happened here, commerce has to continue. And when I said that it didn't really change, it just became worse, that's really what I mean, is that this place is such a necessity for everyone, from the lowest piece of cattle to the highest vampire lord, that it can't get gotten rid of. Radjikar and his vampire court reached a point where they realized we need to start overlooking some things, right? Because if we want our cattle to survive long enough to keep feeding us, then they need trade and items and nutrition and all these kinds, just a little bit, just the smallest trickle, make them fight for it, but it needs to be there. And so, realistically, Wightmarc as a district is the center of this quote-unquote overlooking. The living move about during the day, mostly hugging to the shadows, but still, it's more free than other places. In that location we mentioned, Barrow Hill, and many others, there's small shanty towns built onto merchants and tradesmen selling their wares. You know, the stuff we see in other districts, leech parlors, weapons dealers, pawnbrokers, all of those things are here. Because that level of commerce and exchange, it just seems necessary to make things happen. Vampires want things, and this is where they will go to get them, or find adventurers who will. And you have to remember that not all valuables are tangible, meaning this is also where you could go and see different people from all different districts intersect, which means rumors, work, intelligence, and so on. And I want to pull back a little bit. I mentioned that this is where things are overlooked, right? The activity of mortals is overlooked. That's a little tongue-in-cheek. This is still like a massive military state, just because they're not perpetually worried about a horde of, skeleton warriors coming and just having an extinction level event is not the same thing as things being good. Because of all the dangers that Radjikar doesn't control, the random zombies shuffling about, the necromancers with their own plans, all these things. Just because it's the place where, the collar on the cattle is loosest, does not mean that it's free, at least in a vampire's mind. Because in addition to being, quote unquote, the most relaxed, overlooked place for mortals to congregate, it also has the highest concentration of Ulfenkarn, those skeletal city guard, because, again, you have to be reminded that you are on a leash, no matter how loose it is. Now, this is partially because of keeping order and letting kind of a controlled amount of mortal kind have their freedom, but it's also because the Ulfenwatch has kind of reclaimed or taken advantage of the Van Alten Skyport as its base of operations. So, Carriage and Overlords do not come to Ulfenkarn. Nobody wants to support the vampire regime, if you will, but it does make for a great vantage point that's not the Ebon Citadel, and so it is from here that Commander Alexander Hallgrim keeps watch. He is the head top dog when it comes to the Ulfenwatch, and if you have the game Warhammer Quest Cursed City, he is the skeletal guard commander that comes in the box. He retains a portion of his mind, specifically, of course, the part that's a loyal subject to Radjikar, and he's definitely deserving of his own video, but I briefly did a once-over of his lore in a different video in this same playlist, so go check that out down below. He represents another one of Radjikar's court, protected by the phylacteries that the necromancers make up for them, and at some point, if you want to take on Radjikar himself or join him, you'll probably need to interact with Hallgrim, if nothing else, to be interrogated by him. Now, in addition to being a trade hub still, what happened to the rest of the district? Well, there's a few things. One thing that is noted here is that when Radjikar took power, he gutted all the factories. We touched on this in the Catacombs video, but it seems like part of Radjikar's long-awaited plan to seize the city involved making the final district, the Ebon Citadel, a nation unto itself. Right? Maps and information into it were burned, access cut off, even the underworks were sabotaged. Any of the more superfluous buildings in that district were gutted, and all the industrial power of Mournhold, which was here in Wightmarc, was relocated to the Ebon Citadel. So as you are exploring this, you're going to see burned out, torn apart warehouses, factory places with no machinery in them. That's going to be a regular sight. On the other hand, that also means that there's tools and equipment that, if it were overlooked, could be plundered that would be highly valuable to, say, an artisan, a guildsman, or somebody working for Radjikar's court. The guilds themselves have almost entirely vanished, and the knowledge that they once contained is exceptionally valuable. So if you are out and about and you find instruction manuals, how-to guides, that kind of stuff, science, fact figures, whatever you can find, information really, from these guilds about how to do things, how to achieve things, exceptionally good. Now, I say that the guilds have almost, vanished, but there is one guild that has thrived. And that is, of course, the Butcher's Guild, which makes sense, right? Obviously, everyone's like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. So here's where things get real dark for a hot sec. Basically, this is a guild that functions to use all the parts of a living thing as they can. So, for example, if the Butcher's Guild gets a whale, they'll divvy up the blubber for candle making, the hides for this guy over here, the bone can be used in XYZ. Basically, they divvy up the parts and then off-sell it to the various industries that use those specific parts. But with trade cut off and the city falling into a terrible state, the only thing left to butcher is people. The dead are brought into the guild on carts or just pulled up, by the living with a rope in exchange for a day's wages. No one asks how they got the body, and it's processed just as they have done for centuries with animals. The fat's rendered, the bones are turned to tools, sinew is wound into a string, and so on. And you might be thinking to yourself, wow, how industrious and useful. We should pop by these guys and see what they have for sale. But keep one thing in mind. These are not what you would call quality goods. Because since the Necroquake, ripples of death magic occasionally waft past the city and partially animate the dead tissue that these items are made from. And this is a widely known thing. So if you have the coin, you can get a necromancer to come and basically shut the magic off, like basically deanimate the item. But it puts you in a weird position because, first of all, if you buy a hammer from the Butcher's Guild, that's a soylent hammer. It's a people hammer, which is an existential horror that you need to work past. But then imagine if every time you swing that hammer, it physically recoiled in agony in your hand and screamed. Because you're slamming raw nerves and tendons and you're right what the hammer is made of against something. Or it squirms or it bites. It's just either way, not good for anybody. And what I'm saying here is bargain prices for bargain equipment. It just seems like a really good way to make one player deeply uncomfortable in your party, and I love it. And so as we come to the end here on our discussion of Wightmarc, what makes this section so cool? Why would I want to see more cities have something like this? Well, realistically, this is a very practical location. Come here to arm up. Find quests with the information available to you, and you can sell or identify things. Right? If you found an item and you're like, I don't know what, all the experts who know what things are generally going to be here. I said that Ebonshade was more of a place to explore than a story to be discerned. And if I had to give a similar, synopsis of what Wightmarc adds to the setting, it's a few things. First off, while every district is going to have some merchants with scant inventory, this is the place where you go to arm up. I mentioned it before. It's a way to make players feel like badasses, but also ensure that the party is properly ready for whatever the next challenge is. If you are going to take on a next big chapter of the story of Soulbound, of Ulfenkarn rather, at each of those major milestones, you are going to want to re-equip. But also, I think it's a great backdrop to start introducing some of those more cerebral parts of play. Because the living are allowed to flourish here just a bit more than some of the areas that your characters will likely have visited so far. If you're doing these in order, you don't have to, of course, but in terms of how I'm introducing these various districts, this is one where you have a lot more interactivity with NPCs than anywhere else. Or I should say the first major one. Right? If you have soft skills, I'm going to call them, like bartering, ways of gathering information, finding jobs, all that kind of stuff, this is where those types of skill sets can really shine. And not just skill sets, but remember that there's not a lot of experts. The guilds were annihilated, their factories gutted, most of those people are dead. So, for example, if you are a Kharadron Overlord Soulbound character with a lot of knowledge about literally anything defense related, you immediately walk into that district with an immense amount of value. Because you can help people, you can teach them, that's a thing that you can barter with. It's a great location for bars, if you like the traditional tavern setup for your games, or places where bounties and jobs can be posted by humans, necromancers, and vampires alike. Little something for everyone, but the reason I wanted to point out this is because I do feel like in terms of the order of things that we have explained them on my channel, this is the first one where I feel like those soft skills get a spotlight. There's going to be more, but in terms of, working with NPCs, accruing quests and items and that kind of stuff, it just feels like that's a big emphasis here that I wanted to touch on. Anyway, friends, thank you so much for hanging out with me. I would love to know which of these districts so far is your favorite. Please let me know in the comments down below. And as I mentioned before, I did a poll on my channel about what place we should visit next, and it's still up if you want to go vote for it, but it seems like a pretty handy lead for Anvilgard next. So we're headed to the Realm of Fire. I cannot wait, but we still have a few more videos here in Ulfenkarn all set to go. So thank you so much for hanging out with me, and I will catch you next time. Happy wargaming, friends.